to continue in the lecture on the end of the Taaffe's government. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the young Czechs and their radicalism as they were trying to find their position in terms of the political scene. Then we will talk about the state of emergency in the Prague, in the Bohemia, which has been introduced by the governor Thun, and then the electoral reforms, some attempts to find some kind of solution which may lead to participation of young Czechs on the Taaffe's government, and obviously the failure of those possibilities of them, young Czechs, joining the government and supporting the government, and the end of the Taaffe's political life. Okay, so first of all, let me start with the zenith of young Czech radicalism. As we have already mentioned, there were certain fractions in terms of a young Czech party, and the radicalism was quite an important issue all around the general election 1891. There was criticism of Punktace, as we have already mentioned, and obviously the fight for Czech state rights, and the anniversary of the imperial restricts from 1871, when the emperor was ready to accept or claim he would accept the Czech crown and becoming Czech crowned king. And there were also radical demands of the civil liberties and fostering national cooperation. That's what was the future. What was supposed to be a future strategy of young Czechs. They also were into universal suffrage. So in March 1873, the deputy of Young Czech Party, Jan Slavy, introduced a bill for universal suffrage, male suffrage. Obviously, there has never been women suffrage in the history of Austrian Empire. They didn't succeed, but 10 years after, the discussion started once again, and male suffrage was introduced in 1907. So obviously all Czechs were those who had been beaten, but some of the leaders were still intervening into politics, so expecting the young Czechs would fail because their anticipations were high and the conservative alliance would return. Same idea had the conservative nobility. The government was against the Czech reforms, and they were trying to divide them to find some part of the where conservative young Czechs to participate on the governmental politics without any further success. So the Punktace efforts, those had failed, and the tension between Czech and German nation rose, especially in the areas which were heavily populated by both nations, and then the minorities in the German region. So Liberec and Most, the two cities in the borders regions where the widespread outrages because of the oppression of Czech minorities. And there were also some cultural conflicts, so cultural suppression ban on the commemorating on 300 anniversary of John Amos Comenius, the famous humanism Czech author, and also the Protestant leader. So there were a few currents among the young Czechs. There were realists, which were quite dynamic, pretty young one, emphasizing the need for systematic organized work with the voters, educating them, and promote the wider participation of the people in politics. They were against the fragmentation of party, but they were slightly different than the rest. Then there was a group of all Czechs. These were those who were against the all Czech politics in later years, so they become members of the Young Czech Party. But obviously, there was a farmers union among the Alphonse Šťastný, so these were the agriculture-related people, which becoming quite a strong in terms of the political support, or they got the huge support of the countryside. Then there were the radicals. These were among especially editors of Národní listy, so the dominant the main newspapers, which were led by Julius Gregor, and they had a strong patriotic sentiment, and they were really in favor of the trialism inspired by Hungarian compromise. They they promoted passive resistance, but it was never implemented, and there were also those radicals participating in the following events, especially the young fraction all around Sachin and the others. So, and then the moderate liberals, which were ready to promote some compromise, and they were in favor, whatever was in favor of their voters. So realists as mediators. So obviously the realists about the T.G. Masaryk were those who were really open to progressive movements, so the progressive radicals and also social democracy try to connect the Young Czech Party with lower social classes, and in opposition there was Keitel Kramar, who had the support in middle class industrial elite, and it all ended in a split of the realist part, obviously. So Masaryk leading the Young Czech Party. And they were promoting the idea of all Czech Party, so People's National Party, where would be all the layers of society. And it was, well, good idea, but it didn't work because they started in the 1890s, the fragmentation of political scene and scenery, and the different political parties started to occur, and the cover of one honorary Czech National Party was not really popular at the moment. So it's also necessary to mention the social context and unifying factors. So in Hungary, Austria-Hungary, there were national conflicts, social questions, and problem with authoritarianism, and it was obviously unifying the Young Czech Party as such. There was a social question, same idea of the shared idea of universal suffrage with young Czechs. So young Czechs, it might be interesting, as I've mentioned in a previous lecture, that the young Czechs were also in favor of universal suffrage, though it helped to suppress their dominant role in terms of Czech politics. However, they were united on that idea, and there was the cooperation with Czechoslovak Social Democratic Party, which already existed for some time, since 1878, so 13, 15 years at the moment. Okay, now what about the Taaffe government? So the election 1891 meant the end of the coalition, which was called the parliamentary majority, which was called Iron Ring of the Right. So it was the conservative right parties, and the victory of Young Czechs meant that especially there was the end of the Czech support, and the conservative aristocrats left the Czech club, the parliamentary club, which was disintegrated, and they joined the Hohenwald pro-government club. So Czech aristocrats were supporting the government, but Young Czechs seized their support. They had never supported the government at all. So Czechs were divided here. Moravian Old Czechs, they established independent club, refusing aligning with the Young Czechs or the conservatives. So it meant that the split of the powers, and was difficult for Taaffe to find support of his own government. So there was quite an isolation of Young Czechs in Vienna. They had only 10% of the parliament seats. There was no connection with government or court circles, and they were seen as a subversive element and someone who doesn't want any concessions. So there were people like Gustav Ahm, the person before we mentioned, the drunkard, the person who was advocating the wise opposition, but there were the radicals who prevailed at the moment. So Taaffe's policy was to find support for his government. So he tried to align with German liberals, and obviously it meant that they lost the support of Czechs. And when the Austrian, the old Czech party member, left the government, there were no Czechs. Taaffe sought support from the moderate fractions like Poles, German conservative, but he encountered some kind of resistance. So there was the Hohenwald Club, the conservatives, in monarchy, typically the nobility, and German liberals were supporting him. He was trying to plan some kind of electoral reforms, so especially the voting regulation, which would recalibrate the parliamentary representation. But it met with the opposition on the German liberal and conservative side, and it was obviously welcomed by the Young Czechs, but it didn't fail. And the last attempt, which was in October 1893, was not really getting rid of the Curie system, but it was not universal suffrage, and it failed, and so led to the end of the Taaffe's government. So as I mentioned, there was Young Czechs who introduced the topic of universal secret suffrage. The plan was obvious. So he wanted to increase the Czech representation and diminish the dominance of Germans and aristocrats. So the universal suffrage was seen as a tool how to change the representation of different social layers in Czech in the Vienna Parliament, and obviously in favor of the Czechs, which were as a population quite huge as well as the other Slavic nations. There were also there was attempt to abolish indirect voting over constituencies by František Tilscher, but same and so failed to gain approval. It's necessary to say that there were some those reform ideas, but Czechs, young Czechs, didn't succeed with because of the opposition of the German liberals and conservatives. So, however, Czechs were seen as those who gained respect thanks to their expertise, reformist agenda, and were recognized as quite the modern liberal and social reformist force at that moment. So there were those who came with a dynamism, who they were committed to reforms, and they were trying to change the representation, different social layers in terms of parliament. But the problem was that they were isolated, and it became evident that it's difficult to change the existing parliamentary system. For obvious reason, those who are participating on it and who gain from it are not really ready to change it. Okay, so let's move on to the Bohemia. So as we can see here in the picture, there started a conflict between the radicals and the representative of the central power. So the representative of the central power was the governor František Thun, member of historical Czech nobility from Děčín, so it's the region in the north west Bohemia. He was the governor in early 1890s. He was a land patriot, so he was not any nationalist. So he saw Czech-German reconciliation as the essential thing for the progress of the region. He was also, and that's why he was called coronation governor, advocating for Franz Joseph I to accept the Czech crown, and it was like the land patriotic demand to have a crowned Czech king. That's why the nickname. He recognized quite quickly that the political situation has changed, that the Young Czechs party represents the fierce force, and the others are in defensive or are defensive, so we have to be focused on them. It means that the government should be focused on them. But there was a radicalism on many layers. So we can see that interesting example, Hetman Janda, he openly criticized Habsburg dynasty, blaming it for the plight of the Czech nation since the White Mountain Battle, obviously White Mountain Battle, but the period even before. So since the Habsburg dynasty became the ruling dynasty in Bohemia 1526, and there were the reaction from Thun, obviously, with such claims and speeches, you're becoming isolated, and it's not very positive in terms of future cooperation with the others. What happened in Prague, May 1893, was a huge demonstration. May, approximately 30,000 attendees with hundreds of radicals. They participate in the pilgrimage to honor St. John Nepomuk, and those radicals attempt to topple the statue from the Charles Bridge, symbolically place a noose around the neck of the Emperor Francis I statue. So a representative of the Habsburg power, Francis I, the former emperor in the first half of the 19th century, was having a noose upon his neck. So to kill the member, at least the deceased member of the Habsburg family, that's a problem. There were about 30 individuals, radicals like Antonin Hein or the Alois Rašín, the future political leaders of the Young Czech Party, who staged a nighttime protest outside the aristocratic casino in Selena Street. They were chanting shame of the historical nobility, so there was also the inter-Czech politics tension, and they smashed the windows of the palace of Jiří Lobkowicz. So there was a tension between radicals and the nobility. Exactly. So so that was the open demonstration against the Czech nobility and also the monarchy itself. And the Thun was seen as someone who is moderate, who can come with some solution, build a bridge between Czech and Germans, Czech and the monarchy, and suppress the radicalism. Oh, well, it didn't really work at that moment. So, so the May events of 1893 meant that there was the riots in the streets. There was also the technical obstruction in the land diet, as we have mentioned. So it was very fierce tension among both nationalities. Just reminding you that these were the German politicians who then also introduced the technical obstruction in land diet. So Prague became, from both point of view, the street and also the parliamentary policy, also the center of political unrest. And it fueled the Czech, young Czech, it was basically fueled by young Czechs on both sides. Those progressivists, those progressive forces in Czech called Pokokáři, were those who did this violent demonstration, anti-dynastic, anti-Austrian rhetoric, and obviously seen by state as a treasonous activity. They were disrupting annual imperial birthday celebration, vandalizing symbols of regime, for instance, the hotel, which had the name U Císaře Rakouského, it means the hotel of the Emperor of Austria. So represented, those radicals were represented by the people you can see here in the picture. So Alois Rašín, one of them, Karel Stanislav Sokol, also Václav Štěpán and the others. So there was the September 1893. There was the day of anniversary of Imperial Restrict of 1875. So there was the Restrict of Franz Joseph, where he promised to become king of Bohemia, and it was the platform for Czechs. So a lot of gatherings were banned at that moment, but there was a banquet, a shopping, and there were radical speeches. There were also the public destroying of the statue of emperor and empresses, so, and publicly demonstrated that they are not supporting the monarchy, and they were against it. So state emergency was declared over the Prague the following day and surrounding areas. It was for the first time in 25 years, and there was the initiative of Governor František Thun, and then after improved by the government and the emperor himself, effective all around the Prague. At that time, Prague was not only all those historical free cities, but also the surrounding towns, which then after, during the time of the First Czechoslovak Republic, became parts of nowadays Prague. So Vinohrady, Karolínský Chov, Kladno, Václav. Kladno is independent town nowadays still. So at that bigger, greater Prague, and there was a suspension of civil rights. Very problematic thing. Freedom of press, assembly was suppressed, and some radical newspapers were shut down. The military presence quite high, and the Czech infantry regiment was sent to Linz not to go into troubles. So Czech military was kicked out of the city to prevent any further escalation of conflict. So Governor Thun was quite satisfied with relief. Even the national newspapers informed that, well, the situation has been better, not that radical after the introduction of state of emergency, but there was a very cautious tone because they didn't want to be closed. And what was typically announced was the Havlicek's quote: "It's better to fly with one tie wing than fall silent than be silent entirely." That was the success that there was still a possibility of having certain political activity, but suppressed by the state of emergency. So all the state emergency has been approved by Prime Minister and also by the monarch himself. So what about the young Czechs? In this final era of Taaffe's government, they had little influence upon the governmental politics. That's why also the introduction of the state of emergency was opposed by Czech members of the government, because there weren't any, and they were focusing on Bohemian Diet and Reichstag, imperial delegation. So what is it? So the delegations were the platform where the typically foreign policy was discussed. So both parliaments, the Austrian and the Hungarian, had those representatives who entered the body, which was in common for both parts, and Czechs were also there, and young Czechs were also the members there. One of the most important Karel Kramach, expert on foreign policy, was there as well. And they were attacking here the Austrian-Hungarian policy, especially the ties with Germany and occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they were opposing the policy towards the Balkan states because they were obviously the possibility of future Slavic ties with the Slavic nations here in Balkans, and that probably some of them were expecting Karel Kramach once again, expecting also support from Russia. So they were criticizing the foreign policy as well. It all led to especially the activity in international politics led to exclusion of the young Czechs from the delegations, so imperial delegations. So the deputies were systematically excluded from the delegations committees, and the liberal Germans were substituting them. So let's move on, and let's talk about the end of the government. So we can see that the instability in Prague and the region was one problem which prevent Czech and Germans to find a solution, and the Taaffe government really seek for some kind of compromise. So there was the end of the former coalition, and Taaffe only got the support of Polish deputies, conservative Hohenwald Club, and also the German liberals, and it was not enough. And there was even in the parliamentary majority a problem between the liberals and conservatives. So they have a quite similar policy in terms of nationalism or foreign policy, but obviously the issues related to economy and stuff was a problem. So there were the German liberals who were pressing Taaffe to reject Czech state rights, but he needed the Czechs, and there were conflict obviously with the conservative aristocracy. So a conservative Czech aristocracy was really in favor of Czech state rights, so one of the conflicting area, and there was still tension rising, the nationalistic tension. A good example is Liberec incident, where the mayor Karl Schika introduced a discriminatory policy against the Czechs. So they were banning, he banned the Czech speeches in public at public pools. He also introduced some Prussian or German-style uniforms there, and he didn't want to refuse them. And there was even the conflict between him and Taaffe, who was rather seen as a moderate unifier. What about the young Czechs and their strategy? They were really trying to change the parliament, introducing the universal suffrage. That was the young Slavic idea, that's what we have already mentioned. Why at that moment? Because of the situation in Belgium, where there was at that time after the Great Strike in February and public referendum adopted the universal male suffrage, and same pressure come from the Social Democrats and radical liberals. So that's why also the dominant Czech party wanted the suffrage, though it may harm them in the future. So socialists launching the petition on universal suffrage, and also young Czechs who made it, and the proposal was an emblematic and adopted that as a possible. They adopted that as a their bill. Taaffe, in the end of his government, so almost a month before he failed, and he was substituted, he also introduced a electoral proposal, which didn't really get rid of the Curia system. I will speak about in a few minutes. But he had no force to get the support in a parliament for it, and he was also having health issues. His position was shaken, so it was not accepted in parliament. So there was the universal suffrage bill, which failed at the moment, but in terms of long Czech political strategy, or I would say general social changes, it was really what should have come in future. So universal suffrage was adopted once again in 10 years' time, and since 1907, 1906 it was enacted, and since 1907 every male adult could elect the representatives. Okay, so here is the electoral reform from Taaffe. He was um, he didn't want to abolish the Curia voting system, but he proposed some significant changes in the urban-rural Curia. He nearly was willing to introduce the universal suffrage, so increasing the electorate almost to 4 million people, and it meant 34% of the male voters. It was a monumental step forward, obviously, but it was in a wrong time, and he was at the stage of collapse. It was technically the proposal of Ministry of Finance, who really wanted to avoid some kind of activity from below, and even on the ministerial level, the politicians knew that there is need for such reform, and it would be accepted by Czechs, but by some of them. But radicals wanted the general suffrage. So there was a fierce resistance in the parliament from the Hohenwald conservatives and also plenary liberals, so German liberals. There were the Czech nobility, Polish deputies, aristocratic landowners who were against it, obviously. The young Czechs were supporting their own Slavic, more radical version, and Hungarians were worried about the social democrats in the parliament and spreading democratization in Hungary. And obviously there was a dimension of the foreign policy, so it may cause the end of the Triple Alliance. So Austro-Hungarian, Germany, Hungary, Germany, Italy was not really a democratic club. So especially the Germans didn't want the Austro-Hungary be that democratic. So so the end of the government. So in October, on October 21st, the reform debate began, but there was obviously there is no support from that, and the bloc was declining. The unified support for Taaffe was gone, and also Franz Joseph refused such an attempt to have some kind of universal suffrage. For that reason, he refused to dissolve the Reichsrat, but he named a new prime minister. So, new prime minister Alfred Windischgräber replaced after 14 years the government, prime minister Taaffe. So it's an interesting era. So era of relative stability of 14 years, when the old Czechs, dominantly were participating in Austrian politics, on the governmental level as well. The situation in Bohemia very much helped to the end of the government, especially the tension between radical Czechs, radical Germans, and young Czech activities. But it's necessary to say that Taaffe was the person who addressed Slavic issues. The legacy is obvious. So the Vienna Parliament and the Vienna politics shouldn't be not only about Germans, but also other nations are included. And as we have mentioned, there was widening the last Curia electorate. So also those who paid 5 gold or guilder tax, those were allowed to vote. So enlarging the electorate, including the social Slavic nations into the political affairs, and the end of dominance of German liberals. That's the legacy of the Taaffe. And as I mentioned, one of the longest ever ruling prime minister until the communist time. So only the communists, where there were no elections, had the prime ministers who ruled longer. Okay, so that's the end of this part. So Taaffe's government, and then in the following lecture I will talk about another 20 years of Czech-German political disputes and the tension which rose and ended up in the land both in the situation when Czech land diet wasn't really able to work, thanks to the German opposition, and to nations living in Bohemia ended up in such a conflicting situation that they couldn't any further to cooperate even on the levels which were acceptable before. So that's the end of my lecture, and the following one would be about the rest of 19 1890s.